Now, President Donald Trump says U.S. forces have hit and seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship that tried to get through its naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz.
Iranian state media reported Tehran as saying Washington has violated the ceasefire by firing at one of its commercial ships and that Iranian forces responded by attacking some U.S. military ships with drones. It says it will retaliate against what it called maritime armed robbery by the United States.
Now, the latest escalation comes as uncertainty hangs over the next round of peace talks. Mr. Trump earlier said U.S. negotiators will head to Pakistan today to continue negotiations with Tehran. Iranian state media say Tehran has rejected this, saying that the country has, quote, no plans for now to participate. Islamabad has yet to confirm the talks. Well, for more, we are joined by Jennifer Parker, adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia Defence and Security Institute. She's also a former naval officer with experience in the Middle East. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Firstly, I just want to get your take on just how significant an escalation is, the seizure of this kind. And with Iran now vowing to respond, what do you think could happen next?
Yeah, look, thanks so much for having me on. I think in terms of the seizure of the motor vessel Tosca, which was fired upon by the US Navy when it refused to stop after 6 hours of warnings, I'm not sure this is necessarily an escalation. And I'll explain that. This is part of the US naval blockade that they have enacted for over a week now. Now, a naval blockade is actually a lawful method of war under the law of armed conflict and law of naval warfare. There are some questions about whether it is consistent with a ceasefire. That would really depend on the terms of the ceasefire agreed between the US and Iran, which haven't been made public. So I'm not sure that this is necessarily an escalation at this stage. It will depend on how Iran responds. But it does seem, despite the rhetoric, that both countries are keen to see a long-term end to this conflict. So I think their response may well be quite tempered.
Professor Parker, if, this is an escalation and perhaps this is Iran, testing the U.S. embargo, I'm wondering, on balance, do you think the Iranians are still going to show up despite what Iranian state media has been saying?
Look, that's really hard to say. We know for the negotiations that did occur in Pakistan over a week ago, that in the lead up to that, even just before, it wasn't clear whether the Iranian delegation was or was not going to turn up. And I think that is perhaps part of Iran's tactics to not be clear on it, especially when President Trump has made a statement that the negotiations are going to occur. I think part of their, information operations plan or the strategic communications plan is to make President Trump's statements on Truth Social, which rightfully have gained a lot of eyebrows in terms of the terminology that he has used. Some of it has been completely unacceptable. I think they try and make him sound even more inaccurate by not confirming these details or pushing out different information. So I think we'll have to wait and see. I think it is clear, despite a lot of reporting that Iran is in a strong position in this conflict and all of those comments, I think it is clear that Iran has suffered significantly in terms of their military capability and economically as well. And we'll be looking for a way out of this conflict. But whether that is in the next 24 or 48 hours when this ceasefire expires, that's really hard to say.
And Professor, is it your sense there might be some sort of a power play going on in Iran right now? We've had Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, saying one thing over the weekend, and then we had the IRGC commander saying something else as far as the Strait is concerned.
Yeah, look, I'm really glad you asked this, actually. I think there potentially is. So actually, throughout this conflict, the last 7 weeks or so, we've seen a number of statements from both the president and the foreign minister. And then we've seen actions from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, so the ideological wing of the Iranian military, that have done something else. In fact, in the first week, we saw a statement from the president of Iran saying, we're sorry that we attacked, I'm paraphrasing deeply, but we're sorry we attacked the Gulf states. They are our neighbours. We won't attack them further. And we saw within an hour ballistic missiles launched at the UAE. I suspect the attacks on Indian ships in the Strait of Hormuz by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy on Saturday were perhaps part of that power play. We saw that definitive comment from the foreign minister on social media on Friday night saying the strait was open. And then we saw the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps do something completely different. In fact, attack ships that had been cleared to go through. So I think that is potentially representative of a tussle for power between the military and the political elite.
So where do you see the balance of leverage at this moment at sea?
Look, at sea, I think that it is very clear that Iran's geography allows it to dominate the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Gulf with limited capability. Now, we don't know how much capability they have left in terms of missiles, uncrewed aerial vehicles, or uncrewed surface vessels. There's lots of leaks in lots of papers. I wouldn't necessarily believe any of those statistics. But even with limited capability, because of their geography, they can influence great pressure on merchant shipping around that strait by attacking them. We saw that with small arms fire on the weekend. I think the Iranian comments about the US blockade, the frustration with it, shows that the US blockade of Iranian ports, vessels going in and out of Iranian ports, is being at least mildly effective and causing them some degree of concern. So I think in the maritime domain, the US has a significant amount of leverage. Of course, though, the pushback from the international community on the Strait of Hormuz not having merchant ships flowing through it because of Iran attacks is putting pressure on the US.
Professor Parker, you were saying earlier that both sides, have reasons, motivations to, I guess, have negotiations. But how worried are you about a hasty deal that's reached by, and I read this very often, inexperienced U.S. negotiators? I mean, they do have J.D. Vance. He's senior, but we don't know much about him as a skilled negotiator. We have Witkoff and Kushner, better known as corporate deal makers. So is this worry valid, particularly from the Europeans?
Oh, look, I think it is a valid concern. I would note, though, that when you have those kind of headline teams with the big names, you have a lot of staff behind them who are generally much more experienced in negotiations. So they would be supported by those. Look, I think that there is concern here that last time we had an effective deal, although President Trump did not think it was an effective deal, but an effective deal between the US, Iran, Europe and others regarding Iran's nuclear program, that took at least 20 months to negotiate. So we saw the 21-hour negotiation period a week and a half ago. A second round of negotiations is positive, but whether it can achieve something significant, that's kind of hard to say. And I guess there is a danger here as well. As much as war is horrific and seeing the loss of lives is horrific, there is a danger that if the US walk away without achieving what they need to achieve across that table, and that is Iran giving up their nuclear program, limiting ballistic missile capability production and other elements, then what we might see is a more emboldened Iran, although their military capabilities have been set back, a more ideological Iran, and we may see another conflict within the next 12 months. So it is important that they don't just agree any deal.
And, on the question of flexibility, Professor Parker, do you sense any on the part of the U.S. when it comes to nuclear curbs? There's been talk about sanctions relief, for example, and the unfreezing of Iranian assets, which may be easier to deal with in the immediate term.
Look, I think it's really hard to say in the public domain what are the key elements of this strategic framework that is being discussed. We've seen bits leaked, but you've got to remember when information is leaked to the media, it's often leaked to achieve a certain objective. So whether that really represents the position of both sides is honestly hard to say. I think clearly there will need to be some sort of economic relief for Iran in this deal. So sanctions relief, unfreezing of assets seems to make sense. Also, perhaps some support and investment in rebuilding some of the civilian infrastructure that may have been destroyed during this. So economic relief, I think, will be the key element for Iran and the only thing really that will allow them or get them to agree to give up elements of their nuclear program.
And very quickly, Professor Parker, before we let you go, I'm wondering, what's happening in the Gulf state countries right now, the GCC. There was a story in the New York Times about Qatar being in strategic shock because a close association with the U.S. didn't help. Neither did warming ties, with Iran. I mean, what's going on? What's happening in discussions right now among GCCs?
Look, I think there'll be a lot of concern around the GCC countries about whether a deal is done that actually makes them less safe. I think now that Iran has demonstrated that they will attack their neighbors, there was always, I guess, a thought that Iran would retaliate from US attacks by attacking their neighbors. But now they have done it, it probably makes them feel decidedly less safe. So they will want to see curbs on Iranian military capabilities in this deal. Given that they're not at the table, I think they will have some concern that the US might walk away without achieving that.
All right, Professor Parker, we leave it there for now. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning. Jennifer Parker is adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia Defence and Security Institute.